I still remember the story of that July morning in 1410, when Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen gathered nearly 20,000 Teutonic knights on a broad field near the village of Grunwald. At dawn, they stood in solemn formation, attending Mass beneath the rising sun, absolutely convinced that by nightfall they'd crush the Polish-Lithuanian army once and for all. These weren't your average soldiers. They were warrior monks, men who had conquered Prussia, Estonia, and Latvia in the name of Christ, carving out their own crusader state along the Baltic. For 200 years, their white cloaks marked with black crosses had struck fear from the edges of Russia to the heart of Poland. As hymns filled the air and communion was taken, the knights could see, across the open field, the massive force led by King the Ladislaw II Jagiello, 40,000 men in total. To the Teutons, those pagan Lithuanians were little more than savages, and the Orthodox Russians beside them were heretics unworthy of mercy. But by sunset, the Grand Master's severed head would be raised on a pike, his officers dead, and 20,000 of his knights lying still on the blood-soaked ground, victims of the largest battle medieval Europe had ever witnessed. That day, the mightiest military order in Christendom was wiped from the earth in a single afternoon. The Teutonic Order had built something unlike anything else in Europe at the time, an entire nation governed by warrior monks. From their towering fortress at Marienburg, the largest brick castle on the planet, they ruled over Prussia, pieces of Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and extended their influence from the Holy Roman Empire all the way to Russia. Unlike most crusaders who dreamed of Jerusalem, the Teutonic Knights had forged their own holy kingdom on the Baltic's edge. They claimed their wars were about converting pagans, but in truth, they were building a trade empire, controlling the flow of amber, grain, and Baltic shipping like a corporation blessed by God. Their wealth was staggering. The Order's treasury could bankroll armies larger than most kingdoms could ever field. They had German-forged armor of unmatched quality, the strongest warhorses money could buy, and a proud military tradition stretching back 2 centuries. In every sense, they were professional killers who prayed before they fought, and by 1410 they had never once lost a major battle. On the other side, King the Ladislaw II Jagiello of Poland had married Queen Jadwiga to unite Poland and Lithuania, forming the biggest realm in Europe, one that reached from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. But that alliance was fragile. Poland stood firmly Catholic, while Lithuania had only recently, and somewhat reluctantly, accepted Christianity. Many Lithuanian nobles still whispered prayers to their old gods in secret. The Teutonic Knights branded this union a holy war, a crusade against pagans and heretics, which drew ambitious knights from across Europe eager for glory. The Polish nobles spoke Latin and rode in Western-style armor, while Lithuanian horsemen still fought with Eastern tactics, swift, mobile, deadly with composite bows. Their ranks also included Orthodox Russians from conquered territories, Muslim Tatars serving as nimble light cavalry, and even Czech mercenaries inspired by the new Hussite military ideas. It was, without question, the most diverse army medieval Europe had ever seen, men of different faiths, languages, and fighting styles, united by one shared hatred, the Teutonic Order. The Teutonic host numbered around 27,000, including 20,000 of their own heavily armored knights and sergeants, 3,000 foreign crusaders from France, England, Germany, and Hungary, and 4,000 infantry, Genoese crossbowmen, engineers, and gunners among them. Each knight wore a white surcoat marked with a black cross over gleaming plate armor capable of turning most blades. They carried a lance for the charge, a sword for close combat, and a heavy mace to crush through armor. The Polish-Lithuanian force, though larger at 40,000, was a mixed patchwork of warriors. About 20,000 Polish knights rode in Western plate, 11,000 Lithuanians and Russians fought with lighter gear and Eastern weapons, 2,000 Tatar horse archers carried their deadly composite bows, and 7,000 infantrymen, including Bohemian mercenaries wielding primitive firearms, filled the ranks. That blend of styles and tactics was something the Teutonic Knights had never faced all at once. The two armies met on the field surrounded by 3 small villages, Grunwald to the Poles, Tannenberg to the Germans, and Žalgiris to the Lithuanians, names that would echo through history. The battlefield itself was open farmland bordered by thick woods and swampy patches, a natural bowl about 3 kilometers wide. A few sluggish streams and muddy lowlands would soon become deadly traps for heavy cavalry. Grandmaster von Jungingen had chosen that ground deliberately, convinced the tight terrain would cancel out his enemy's superior numbers and funnel them into his ideal killing zone. He had ditches dug to trip enemy charges and arranged his forces on slightly raised ground. The July air was hot and wet with humidity, the morning mist burning off into a brutal sun that turned steel armor into an oven. By dawn, both sides had formed into 3 huge divisions called battles. The Teutonic right wing held Swiss and German crusaders under Grand Marshal Friedrich von Wallenroder. The left flank was commanded by the Order's finest cavalry led by Grand Comte Kuno von Liechtenstein, and in the center, Grandmaster Ulrich himself waited with 16 elite banners held in reserve. Opposite them, the Polish-Lithuanian host spread out in mirrored formation, Lithuanians, Russians, and Tatars under Grand Duke Vytautas on the right, Polish heavy cavalry on the left under Marshal Zindram of Maskowitz, and King Jagiello himself commanding the reserves from the rear. Between the two lines stretched a kilometer of trampled grain fields that would soon drink more blood than rain. Both sides had dragged out primitive cannons, early bombards, but they were so unreliable that they'd make little difference in what was to come. By late morning, the armies faced each other in silence, neither willing to strike first. The Grandmaster, growing restless, finally lost his patience. His men had stood in steel since sunrise, roasting in the July heat. In a moment of arrogance and provocation, he sent 2 naked swords across the field with heralds who mocked the Polish king, shouting, "Our Grandmaster sends you these blades to help you fight. Since you hide in the woods like cowards and delay like women, come out and fight," they sneered. "Or we'll drive you out with sticks like sheep." It was a calculated insult, meant to goad Jagiello into a reckless charge. But the Polish king simply ignored the taunts and continued hearing mass under the trees while his men rested in the shade. When he finally gave the order to advance around noon, the Teutonic knights had already been baking in their armor for 6 hours, parched, weary, and drained before the first sword was even raised. When the church bells struck noon, the silence finally shattered. Grand Duke Vytautas unleashed his Lithuanian light cavalry, and they stormed across the field toward the Teutonic left flank. It was a sight to remember, thousands of horsemen sweeping forward like a living tide, their battle cries rising in a wild mix of Lithuanian, Russian, and Tatar tongues. Arrows hissed through the air, the Tatars firing their short composite bows with deadly precision, slipping shafts into the narrow joints of Teutonic armor, the few places steel couldn't protect. On the other side, Kuno von Liechtenstein's knights braced for impact. Crossbowmen fired volleys while the heavy cavalry steadied their mounts, preparing to countercharge. When the two forces collided, the sound was like thunder, with splintering, armor cracking, and horses screaming in pain. The Lithuanians struck hard but couldn't punch through the Teutonic line. Still, their relentless rain of arrows was carving a toll in men and morale alike. After nearly an hour of fierce fighting, the unexpected happened. The entire Lithuanian right wing suddenly broke. From the Teutonic lines, men watched in disbelief as Grand Duke Vytautas himself appeared to be retreating, his banner vanishing behind a wave of horsemen galloping away in panic. To the Teutons, it looked like total collapse. Cheers erupted across their ranks. Unable to resist the temptation, Liechtenstein ordered the pursuit. Thousands of armored knights spurred their horses forward, chasing what they believed was a fleeing enemy. Some chroniclers later swore the Lithuanians truly panicked, but others argued it was a brilliant trick, the same feigned retreat the Mongols had used on the steppes for centuries. Whatever the truth, that decision sealed the Teutonic fate. A huge part of their army was now scattered, thundering away from the main battle, their horses worn out, their formation shattered in the chaos of pursuit. And right at that moment, when the Teutonic left had all but vanished, the Polish heavy cavalry struck. Marshal Zindram of Maskowitz led 20,000 Polish knights, some of the most heavily armored men in Europe, straight into the Teutonic center. They rode in tight, disciplined formations called banners, each one holding its line with almost mechanical precision. When they hit, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Lances punched through plate, horses collided chest to chest, and men were crushed between iron and earth. Through it all, the Polish knights sang Bogurodzica, their ancient hymn to the Virgin Mary, their voices carrying over the clash of steel. It was as if faith itself gave rhythm to the slaughter. Grand Marshal Friedrich von Wallenrode tried desperately to pivot his right wing to reinforce the center, but Polish reserves under Crown Prince the Ladislaw blocked his path. Soon, the whole battlefield dissolved into a massive, grinding melee, a chaos where individual skill mattered less than sheer endurance and willpower. Both sides had brought early cannons, crude bombards meant to shatter enemy formations, but in that swirling chaos they were almost useless. The Teutonic artillery crews couldn't fire without hitting their own men. When they did manage a shot, the stone balls either buried themselves harmlessly in the soft ground or flew wide. One bombard even exploded, killing its crew and sending panic rippling through nearby ranks. The Polish gunners didn't fare any better. Their bombards managed only a handful of shots before being overrun by the shifting tide of battle. Gunpowder had a future in warfare, but not that day, not at Grunwald. This fight would be settled the old way, by muscle, steel, and blood. And just when the Teutons thought victory was within reach, the trap snapped shut. The Lithuanians who had fled suddenly wheeled around in perfect formation, their retreat turning into a devastating counterattack. Even worse, fresh Lithuanian reinforcements that had been hidden in the nearby forest now charged into the exhausted Teutonic flank. Kuno von Liechtenstein realized too late that he'd been outplayed. His knights, scattered and spent from the chase, were caught completely off guard. The Lithuanians had lured them into the marshes, where the heavy Teutonic horses bogged down while the lighter mounts danced around them. Trapped in the mud, the knights were easy prey. They were pulled from their saddles, beaten down with axes and maces, and left lifeless in the muck. Liechtenstein himself was dragged from his horse and killed, his famous armor dented and cracked beneath a warhammer's blows. Back near the center, the main Teutonic line was crumbling. The heat was unbearable. Men were literally cooking inside their armor. Some collapsed from exhaustion, dying without a single wound. The Poles fought smart, rotating fresh units into the fray while their tired men fell back to rest. The Teutonic Order had no such luxury. Every knight had to fight until he dropped. Grand Marshal Wallenrode tried to hold the right flank together, but fate caught up with him too. A Polish lance found the small gap under his arm and drove deep into his chest. He fell from his horse, blood bubbling from his mouth, and as his men saw him fall, their formation began to unravel. By now, the once mighty Teutonic battle line had splintered into isolated pockets. Groups of knights surrounded on all sides, fighting to the death. Seeing his army collapse before his eyes, Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen made a desperate choice, one that would finish the Teutonic Order forever. Instead of retreating to regroup, he gathered his elite reserve, 16 banners of the Order's finest knights, around 3,000 men, and ordered a final, all-or-nothing charge straight toward King Jagiello's position. "We die here or we win here," he reportedly shouted. And with that, the Grandmaster led his men forward. What followed was both magnificent and horrifying. A wall of shining steel, lances lowered, charging as one. Their battle cry, "Christ and St. George!" roared across the field as they smashed through the first Polish line like it was made of paper, then tore into the second. For a moment, it seemed as though they might actually reach the king himself. For a few tense moments, it truly looked like the Grand Master's charge might reach King Jagiello himself. The Teutonic knights plowed through the Polish lines like a steel tornado, cutting down anyone in their way until the king's personal guards had to form a living wall around him. You could almost feel the ground trembling under that last desperate surge. Ulrich von Jungingen stood out in the chaos. His armor glinted with gold crosses and imperial eagles, an unmistakable symbol of command. That shining armor made him a beacon for every Polish warrior on the field. A knight named Dobislaw of Olesnica is said to have landed the first blow, his sword slamming into the Grand Master's helmet with enough force to dent the steel. As Ulrich turned to face him, a Lithuanian noble, Duke Lingvinis, lowered his lance and drove it straight through the visor, piercing the Grand Master's skull. But not everyone tells it that way. Some chroniclers claimed he was dragged from his horse by common soldiers and beaten to death with clubs. However it happened, one thing is certain: the Grand Master died surrounded by enemies. His last words were reportedly, "Christ, receive my spirit." The moment he fell, the entire Teutonic command structure unraveled like a cut rope. Within minutes, their leadership was gone, wiped out in a small circle around their fallen banner. Grand Treasurer Thomas von Meerheim was found later with 17 wounds. Grand Comptroller Marquard von Salzbacher's skull had been cleaved in two. Johann von Schönfeld, who oversaw the order's supplies, was thrown from his horse and trampled to death in the mud. Even Conrad von Liechtenstein, Kuno's brother, died trying to retrieve the Grand Master's body. Practically every senior commander of the order perished within a space no larger than a football field. The strict hierarchy that had once made the Teutonic Knights so powerful now doomed them. With their leaders dead together, the rest of the army became a headless body, thrashing in confusion. Once the word spread that Ulrich von Jungingen had fallen, discipline collapsed completely. What had been a proud army turned into a desperate mob, every man fighting only to survive. But there was nowhere to run. The battlefield was hemmed in by marshes and thick forests that quickly turned into death traps. Many knights reached a small brook, only to find its banks too steep for their armored horses. In panic, they dismounted and tried to wade across, but their 60 pounds of plate armor turned into anchors. They sank beneath the water, drowning as they clawed for the far side. On the opposite bank, Polish and Lithuanian horsemen waited, using their lances like spears to shove struggling knights back into the water. Within minutes, hundreds had drowned, their bodies clogging the stream until others could cross by stepping over the dead. Witnesses said the marsh grass was so drenched in blood it looked like a crimson lake. Those who fled toward the forest fared no better. The Lithuanian light cavalry and Tatar horse archers were built for that kind of fight, fast, nimble, deadly. The armored Teutons, weighed down and exhausted, could barely move between the trees. What followed wasn't a battle anymore. It was a hunt. The Tatars shot down horses first, leaving knights helpless on foot before finishing them off with axes and maces. Some Teutons tried to surrender, offering ransom, but in the heat and bloodlust of pursuit, mercy was rare. Polish peasants from nearby villages poured into the fight, wielding whatever tools they could find: scythes, hammers, pitchforks, exacting revenge for years of Teutonic brutality. By late afternoon, the woods and fields had turned into a graveyard. The forest floor glittered with fallen armor and noble corpses. Horses stumbled over heaps of bodies so thick they could hardly find footing. The area where the Grand Master had fallen was described as a carpet of white cloaks stained dark red, a ghastly parody of snow. The air was filled with groans and pleas in half a dozen languages. Wounded men called for water while looters moved among them, slitting throats and stripping armor from the dead. Under the blazing sun, the heat quickened the rot. The smell of blood, sweat, and decay was unbearable, thick enough to taste. Clouds of flies swarmed so dense they turned the air black. Above, the crows and ravens gathered in such numbers that the sky itself seemed to dim. Polish and Lithuanian soldiers methodically checked the bodies, making sure no high-ranking Teutonic knights had survived. While thousands were slaughtered, thousands more were taken prisoner, and their fate depended entirely on who captured them. Nobles who surrendered to Polish lords could expect proper captivity, even ransom and eventual release. But those who fell into Lithuanian hands faced darker ends. Some of Vytautas's men were still half-pagan, and a few Christian chroniclers claimed they sacrificed Teutonic prisoners to their old gods, though that might have been more legend than fact. Common soldiers and sergeants weren't so lucky. With no ransom value, most were either executed on the spot or enslaved. The Tatars took hundreds back to the steppe markets as captives. Others, especially captured knights of rank, were chained and marched to Krakow for King Jagiello's triumph. A grim parade that marked the death of the Teutonic dream. The most valuable captive taken that day was Kazimierz of Szczecin, a noble who would spend years behind Polish walls, negotiating the steep price for his own freedom. Among the spoils of victory, none were more symbolic than the captured banners. The Polish-Lithuanian army took 51 of the Teutonic Order's battle standards, every one of them representing a unit wiped off the field. Even the Grand Master's personal flag, emblazoned with the Black Eagle, and the sacred banner of St. George fell into Polish hands. When the smoke cleared, they found the Grand Master's body among the heaps of the dead, his golden-trimmed armor making him easy to identify. Some say the pagan Lithuanians wanted to burn his corpse as an offering to their gods, but King Jagiello wouldn't allow it. He ordered that the Grand Master be buried as a Christian, an act of mercy that stood out amid the horror. Ulrich's armor, his sword, and his golden spurs were sent to Krakow Cathedral, where they would remain as timeless trophies of victory. Even the Teutonic war chest, packed with gold meant to pay their army, was seized intact. It was enough money to finance Poland's campaigns for years to come. When the sun rose on July 16th, the scale of the slaughter became clear. All day long, soldiers of the victorious alliance moved across the fields, counting, sorting, and stripping the dead. Of roughly 27,000 Teutonic warriors who had marched to Grunwald, somewhere between 8 and 14,000 lay lifeless, including 203 of the 250 brother knights, nearly the entire leadership of the order. Another 14,000 were captured or scattered, leaving almost nothing behind that could be called an army. The victors had suffered heavily too. About 4,000 Poles and 8,000 Lithuanians and Russians had fallen. But unlike the Teutons, their losses were replaceable. The ground itself was so thick with bodies that they had to dig mass graves simply to make space for the living. The July heat made the work unbearable, and decay set in fast. Huge funeral pyres burned for days, the smoke hanging over the fields like a shroud. Even decades later, peasants turning their soil would uncover bones, grim reminders of the day the Crusaders died. Medical care in 1410 was primitive at best, and no one was prepared for the sheer number of wounded. Thousands of men lay dying slowly from injuries that today would be treatable, but back then were death sentences. A sword cut to the abdomen meant infection and agony. A crushed skull from a mace left a man conscious but doomed as his brain swelled. Limbs shattered by horses or weapons had to be hacked off without anesthesia. Most bled out or went into shock before the blade was even cleaned. The unlucky ones lingered for days, feverish and screaming in the summer heat. Both armies tried to set up makeshift field hospitals, but there were far too many casualties. Monks and camp followers moved among the wounded, offering prayers and last rites more often than medicine. For days after the battle, the sound of men crying out in pain haunted the fields of Grunwald. With the Teutonic army destroyed, King Jagiello led his troops toward Marienburg, the order's fortress capital and the largest brick castle in all of Europe. Along the roads lay abandoned armor, shattered weapons, and dying stragglers, many of whom were finished off without ceremony. The king and his men expected the end of the order to be swift. Surely, after such devastation, Marienburg would surrender. But fate had other plans. Heinrich von Plauen, a Teutonic commander who had missed the battle, reached the fortress ahead of the Polish-Lithuanian army with 3,000 survivors. He refused to yield. When Jagiello's forces surrounded the castle, dysentery tore through their ranks, supplies dwindled, and the siege eventually faltered. That single act of defiance saved the Teutonic Order from total destruction, though it would never recover its old might. News of the catastrophe spread across Europe like wildfire. The Christian world was stunned. Many refused to believe it at first, that the proud knights of God had been annihilated by an army of Catholics, pagans, and Orthodox soldiers fighting side by side. The Pope reportedly dismissed the reports as impossible. The Holy Roman Emperor called for a new crusade to avenge the loss, but none came. France and England, still locked in their own endless conflict, sent only letters of sympathy. In contrast, Poland and Lithuania erupted in celebration. Churches held days of thanksgiving, bells rang from Krakow to Vilnius, and the captured wealth was distributed among the victors. Feasts lasted for weeks. Almost immediately, Grunwald became legend. Polish chronicles proclaimed it divine justice, God's punishment for Teutonic arrogance. Lithuanian songs celebrated Vytautas's clever tactics and the bravery of their horsemen. German writers, unable to accept such defeat, blamed witchcraft, treachery, or even the devil's hand rather than face the truth. Yet behind the myths, one undeniable lesson remained. The old order of warfare had changed. The age of the heavy knight, the armored horseman who had dominated Europe for centuries, was ending. At Grunwald, their era died beneath a storm of arrows, cunning maneuvers, and the power of unity among different peoples. The Teutonic Order's strength had always been its rigid discipline and command. But on that summer day, that very structure became their undoing. In the end, the Teutonic Knights' greatest weakness was their strength, their reliance on uniformity. Their heavy cavalry, disciplined and elite as they were, simply couldn't adapt to the mix of enemies they faced that day: Lithuanian speed, Polish weight, and Tatar precision. The Battle of Grunwald proved that a well-coordinated, diverse army could outthink and outfight even the most elite military order in Europe. It showed that numbers, when used wisely, could crush even the best armor and training. The lessons from Grunwald didn't fade. They reshaped military thinking for generations. Europe was changing, shifting from the medieval world of knights and crusaders into the dawn of modern warfare. The Teutonic Order, stripped of its leadership, could never recover. How could it? Nearly every trained brother knight had fallen on that field. Who would volunteer to join an order that had lost its holy aura and its entire army? Their subjects in Prussia and Livonia sensed weakness and began to rebel. The order's treasury was drained dry, its coffers emptied by war expenses and massive ransoms. In 1411, under the First Peace of Thorn, the once proud crusaders were forced to pay crushing reparations to Poland, a humiliation that marked the beginning of their long decline. They tried to rise again, but another disastrous conflict, the 13 Years' War of 1454 to 1466, broke them for good. When it was over, the mighty Teutonic state had become a mere vassal of the Polish crown. The Crusader Empire that had terrorized Eastern Europe for 200 years was reduced to a shadow of itself. By 1525, the last Grand Master, Albrecht of Brandenburg, converted to Protestantism, renounced his vows, and turned what was left of the order's lands into the secular Duchy of Prussia. And yet, the memory of Grunwald refused to fade. Every nation that fought there claimed it as their own. For Poland, it was their crowning victory, proof that Polish courage and cavalry could humble even the most formidable enemy. For Lithuania, it was a celebration of cunning and unity, a moment when their tactics and heritage triumphed over centuries of crusader arrogance. To the Germans, though, it was Tannenberg, a wound that festered for centuries, a defeat that demanded vengeance. And vengeance eventually came, at least symbolically, in 1914 when General Hindenburg crushed the Russians on that same soil and named his triumph the Battle of Tannenberg, deliberately invoking the memory of 1410 to erase the shame of it. The Russians, for their part, emphasized their ancestors' role at Grunwald, claiming their share of glory in that ancient alliance. Over time, the battle became more myth than memory, each nation bending the story to fit its own narrative. But whatever version you hear, the truth remains the same. July 15, 1410, was the day the crusading age began to die. Even now, Poland and Lithuania mark the date with pride, celebrating their greatest medieval victory. Grunwald was more than just a battle. It was a turning point. It signaled the end of Europe's military religious orders as serious powers. The Teutonic Knights' destruction proved that divine mission could no longer justify conquest or empire. The world was moving on. National monarchies were rising, and professional armies, loyal to kings and countries, not to God's causes, were taking the stage. Faith was giving way to politics, and the age of crusades was crumbling under the weight of reality. Within a century, the Protestant Reformation would sweep across Europe, and the idea of holy warrior orders would fade into the pages of history. Those white cloaks with black crosses, once symbols of fear and divine authority, became nothing more than relics behind glass, reminders of an era when men believed they could conquer in God's name. The Battle of Grunwald stands as the largest and most decisive clash of the medieval world. Around 70,000 men fought there, and some 30,000 never walked away. In just 6 hours, European history changed forever. The Teutonic Order began that morning as one of the most powerful military forces on the continent, confident, armored, and certain that God was on their side. By sunset, they were broken. Poland and Lithuania rose as the dominant power in Eastern Europe for the next 3 centuries, while the once mighty Crusader knights faded into memory. But beyond the politics and the glory, Grunwald revealed something timeless, that faith, reputation, and steel mean little against strategy and numbers. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen had started that morning convinced divine favor guaranteed victory. He ended it lying in the mud, his body stripped of armor, surrounded by the corpses of his brothers. The 20,000 Teutonic knights who sang hymns at dawn were all dead by dusk. Their white cloaks turned crimson, their prayers unanswered. Grunwald showed that claiming to fight for God didn't make you invincible. It only meant you might die believing he was still on your side. That summer day in 1410 didn't just end an army. It ended an age.